Good evening, everyone. Hello, welcome to Tortoise. I'm Merope. I'm a partner and editor here at Tortoise. I'm delighted to be virtually here with you this evening and virtually here with the lovely Elizabeth Day, the award-winning journalist, the celebrated podcaster, the best-selling author of fiction and non-fiction books, including her latest, which I model here, Failosophy, a handbook for when things go wrong, which they seem to be doing a lot at the moment, or maybe that's just me. Before we get stuck in, I would love to hear all of your thoughts on failures, or indeed your own failures. And as some of those slides said, there are two ways you can do that. You can raise your hand by using the cursor. I'm sure you all know this by now. Everyone's so familiar with Zoom. Clicking participants, raise hand button appears, and I will see your little blue digital hand go up, and I will come to you. Or you can chat with my lovely colleague, Phoebe Davis. Give us a little wave, Phoebe. Very much in the dark, Phoebe. Me with my Gestapo lighting and you in the dark. We're doing very well. And so do get stuck in, and we'd love to hear from you all throughout this evening. Elizabeth, coming to you first. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is the first page of your new book, which is very, very funny. Talks about how you've been thinking about failure non-stop for, is it 6 or more years, non-stop thinking about failure. But you talk about how you came to do your podcast, how you failed to name it properly because you'd failed to do the research, which discovered that there was already a podcast called How to Fail. And you funded it all, as we know, by selling your wedding dress from your failed marriage. You make it all sound extremely humorous, but I guess it wasn't all humorous in that moment.
No, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me back. I loved the last Tortoise ThinkIn that I did, and it's really lovely to be back in this very professional Zoom environment. And you're right that although I make it sound relatively humorous for the first page of the book, because I was very aware that not everyone wants to pick up a book about failure and buy it and acknowledge that they too are a failure and need to learn about it. So I sort of wanted to ease people in who perhaps weren't familiar with the podcast. But yeah, the podcast came first, and then I started writing books about failure subsequently. And the podcast very much came from a place of my own failures and I guess my own sadness about that. So to cut a very long story short, my 30s were a decade of intense transition where on the one hand, I'd had some kind of professional success. I was a staff feature writer on a Sunday newspaper. I'd written my first couple of novels, but personally things had not gone according to plan. So I had got married and then divorced. I had tried and failed to have babies. And then I got into a new relationship post-divorce that ended brutally out of the blue 3 weeks before my 39th birthday. And I was kind of left reeling from that thinking, hang on a second, I'm staring down the barrel of my 40s and I am single without children and I hadn't expected to be here right now. And that was really the genesis of my thinking about failure and what it meant to me and what it represented. And what I ended up realizing was that for every time I had failed or hit a bump in the road, or there had been some life crisis that I wasn't in control of, I had rediscovered my strength because I had survived it. And it just made me realize that I'd learned a lot about who I was and what I wanted and what life was as a result of them, far more so than the things that had gone right and gone smoothly and gone according to plan. So that was the reason I got really fascinated in it and the reason I launched the podcast. And, you know, with my journalist hat on, because I've been a journalist for so many years, it feels like I've been a journalist since 1850 because there wasn't even like internet on all our computers when I first started. We could still smoke in the office.
I remember those days. We used to work in the same office.
I know. So, but with my journalist hat on, I sort of knew that eBaying my wedding dress would be quite a good story. So I was, but I also, it was symbolic for me because it had been kind of hanging in the cupboard of my new tiny rented flat, like a sort of shroud, like a reminder of all the things that had gone wrong. And so it was very symbolic being able to eBay it and then package it up and send it away to this woman in Suffolk, and come out feeling a lot less weighted down. And that's what I wanted How to Fail the podcast, and that's what I want Failosophy to do for other people.
So Failosophy has got these sort of 7 principles at the heart of it. I'm going to come to some of those in a minute, because actually you just touched on 2 or 3 of them just by mentioning, your 30s, that sense of a generation, and that sort of thing. But before we do, I just want to go right to the end of the book, because one of the things I was struck by, well, first of all, listening to your podcast, which is so brilliant to me, it's like a sort of modern day desert island discs, in the sense that you get a real raw honesty out of people that is often quite surprising to other interviews. And that real raw honesty comes through right at the end of your book, where you've done something quite interesting, which is to say that when you invite someone onto your podcast, you ask them to email you beforehand and say, which failures are you going to talk about? And there is something almost sort of therapeutic about the way that they write to you, even when they're bullet points. And I'll give everyone, here they are. I'll just read one of them to you now. Lem Sissay, poet. Number 1, I failed to marry. I failed to have children. Number 2, I failed to maintain the family I spent my life searching for. Number 3, I failed to become the poet I once hoped to be. But some of them are really very long as well, like, really detailed. I want to talk about, my eating disorder for the first time, or I want to talk about my terrible relationship with my father. It must feel quite an experience to have that really intimate emails and then intimate conversations with such a wide range of people. What's that like?
Such a good question. And the short answer is it's amazing. I feel enormously privileged that people honor me with their stories and trust me with their stories. And I'm also aware that I speak from a position of extreme privilege. I'm white, I'm middle class, I have a roof over my head, and I make my living from sitting at a laptop. And that's why I seek out a very diverse range of people for the podcast, because I am fascinated in doing field work into failure. I mean, that's a sort of posh way of saying asking loads of nosy questions. But it's a really wonderful thing. And actually, as the podcast has grown, I think people are now more aware of what it means to come on it and what it consists of. So now I'm in the very lucky position that when people come on, they tend to have a general idea of where I'm going to go with the conversation. And so they come willing to open up and be vulnerable and to talk about the things that they might not necessarily talk about in another format of interview. And we touched on the fact that we used to work together. I used to work as a Sunday newspaper feature writer, and I was constantly being sent to interview celebrities who were promoting their latest film or their latest skincare range or their latest album. And obviously in those situations, those people want to talk about all the things that have gone right in their lives and all the enormous successes that they want to promote. And I think actually there was a genuine thirst, not just from listeners and readers to talk about vulnerability and when things didn't go right, but also from high profile people who don't often get that chance to explore their more human side. And one of the highest compliments you can pay me is to say that it feels like therapy, because that it does feel very special and intimate when a podcast interview goes well. I think the other reason that people like Lem Sissay or Malcolm Gladwell or Kelly Holmes or Phoebe Waller-Bridge are willing to go there is because, as you say, I asked them in advance for their 3 failures. And that provides the scaffolding of the podcast interview. And I think that hopefully helps someone feel safe because they've set the parameters of the conversation. That's not to say that the conversation doesn't then go off in a million different directions, but they sort of know what the anchors are going to be, and they've decided that they're ready to talk about them. And when you mentioned the eating disorder at the first time, that was Fern Cotton, who decided that How to Fail was where she felt comfortable talking about that for the first time. And so it's an immense privilege. And with my other hat on, I'm also a novelist, and there's nothing better as a novelist than being able to ask people questions about their lives. It's a source of perpetual fascination to me. So yeah, short and long answer, it's amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. As a sort of editor, it's amazing to read these emails, because you delight any interviewer coming back with those sorts of stories is incredible, and you just have this sort of like, people bearing their souls in your inbox, and it's really quite incredible to read that raw material.
Can I just say very quickly that I did ask everyone for permission
I
to
knew-
use their emails because
I
they
know.
do. You're right. They're so honest, some of them. And I wanted to put them in because I truly feel that often the way someone expresses a failure is just as telling as the failure itself.
Yeah, I'm going to come in a second. I'm going to come to Nacho. I'm just giving you some warning, Nacho, because you're talking about, you know, people feeling their whole world activities, jobs disappear, and failure, and what advice Elizabeth gave you. So I'm just giving Nacho some warning about that. But before I do, can I just talk to you about how your attitude to failure has changed, in the sense that, you know, there's this line in the book where you say the universe is unfolding is exactly as it's meant to, and then you read the words, which sounds a bit woo-woo, but it's true. And it did, you know, it does sound a bit woo-woo, and it does sound a bit, you know, this is just fate taking its course, and you've got to have faith or something. Do you feel you've become sort of more hippie-ish, or more sort of in the time doing it, that you've just become, this is just how it's meant to be?
That's so interesting. I think I've always been a bit like that. So I've always been a bit woo-woo, to use my own terminology. And what I meant by that, so it's actually a Max Ehrmann quote. He wrote a prose poem called Desiderata, which I first read on the back of a loo door. And I've since discovered that a lot of people had that same poem on the back of bathroom doors. It's very weird, or hanging in their kitchen. The universe is unfolding exactly as is intended. And I choose to believe that because it enables me to be at peace when difficult stuff happens. And that belief is not for everyone. And I completely appreciate that when something difficult happens, there needs to be a necessary process of processing grief and coming to terms with it, and coming to terms with your experience of it. But as the Buddhists say, pain is inevitable and suffering is optional. So pain will always happen, failure will always happen, and it might cause you a great deal of sadness. But it's my choice not to live in that place of sadness, and to believe that the failure will end up teaching me something necessary that I can apply in the future, and that will make me realize that actually I'm on a better path now than the one I was on. And I say in the book that that's how I choose to look at it. And I completely understand that's not for everyone. And it doesn't have to be a spiritual faith or a religious faith. It can be a faith in community. It can be a faith in connectedness. It can be a faith in something that you can't fully explain, but that gives you a sense of a meaning greater than just you. Because I think that part of the issue with the positive psychology movement is that it's incredibly individualistic. I mean, President Trump is one of the foremost advocates of it, and that tells you all you need to know. And I think, you know, living life is harder than just manifesting positive thoughts and it all coming to you. Now, there is a place for positive thinking, and I go into that a bit in Failosophy, but it's not the be all and end all. And ultimately, it's not just about you. It's not just about being your best self. It's about how we connect as humans through our shared vulnerability, and what kind of sense of strength and solidarity we can get from that. That can be a kind of faith too.
Okay. All right. I'll come to Nacho now, and then, you know, anyone else who wants to say anything, stick their hand up, or otherwise you'll just hear me asking questions all night. Hello, Nacho.
Hello, how are you? How's everybody? Thank you,
Thank you.
Elizabeth, for that most illustrative allocution. First, I cannot believe that you actually had an unexpected breakup. I cannot believe like you could have a breakup at all. If you admit me.
Nacho, are you hitting
Anyway,
those Zooms?
Thank you.
How to get married.
Okay. And coming back to the point, the thing is that I think there is an interesting question on the definition of failure. The thing is that we can have failure, let's say, of taking a wrong decision, and the thing is that is about the fail fast framework. The thing is that make your mistakes early, and I come from probably a background where failure was not well seen, and it was something to avoid at all costs. But failure is something that you learn. Even like AI systems tend to be like trial and error. So things that failure is something that you can learn on. Then there are other ways of failure. The things that, and I was putting the example in the chat. Let's say that you are in a profession, and that not only your job disappears, but maybe your profession disappears. The thing is that technology makes it redundant, or the market moves on to the next thing. And the thing is that then you have to learn to downsize or to, start afresh. So things that is another level of failure. Maybe you cannot learn from the failure, but you have basically to reinvent yourself. And that I also was commenting in the chat is, what's the perception of failure when you are having maybe a peer pressure or society pressure to do something that is not bound on the true nature. So I was reading, I think that's a quite popular book, The Why Sleep Matters, I think it's called. The thing is that it says that basically people are genetically morning or evening person. So thing is that you may be like excruciatingly killing yourself every day, trying to get up at ridiculous hours when the thing is that your body is actually not wired in that manner. So thing is that there is a point, I think, needed of self-acceptance of how you are and how to make the most of how you are, instead of being somebody that you are not.
Yeah.
So maybe, I don't know, people should get out of the, I don't know, being an evening person closet or something like that.
Thank you, Nacho. There's so much that you said there. That one of the things that you touched on was sort of society's expectations, which of course is one of your principles, isn't it, Elizabeth?
What an amazing question. Thank you so much, Nacho. And thank you also for the extraordinary compliment you paid me at the beginning. And you touched on so many things that I want to talk about. It's almost like I've planted you. So thank you. So social expectations is a super interesting one. And that thing that you mentioned about not being a morning person, that piece in the New Yorker I read, and I was like, yes. And I then wrote a piece about it because I'm not a morning person. And lockdown taught me that actually my natural hours, my most creative hours are sort of 5 to 7 p.m, which I never got to use in the past because everyone was ending their working day then, and that's when you go out for drinks. And so I think that's a super interesting point. And I want to come on to the first part of your question after this. So Merope, remind me if I don't get onto it. Okay. So social conditioning is a fascinating topic to me specifically, because one of the failures in my life that has caused me the most sadness and trauma is my failure to have babies thus far. So I have gone through unsuccessful IVF. I have had 3 miscarriages now. I've had various operations. I've gone through egg freezing, all of that. And it's been really difficult to come to terms with that. And when I had my first miscarriage, I really had to assess where my desire to have children was coming from, because so much of that for women and also for men is social conditioning. And in the same way, when my marriage ended, I had to ask myself why I was feeling like a failure. And I realized that a lot of my perception of what I should be like came from a diet of 1980s rom-coms. And that is no way to live a life. I mean, it's ridiculous. My life is never going to be Sleepless in Seattle. And I think that we've been culturally conditioned in certain ways to expect that life is a smooth motorway from points A, B, C, right through to Z. And what I've discovered is that life is a series of really interesting experiences of getting lost on country byroads, that although you didn't want that, I know from my experience of not having had children that I have learned an enormous amount through that. I've come into contact with the most phenomenal women who have taught me so much about modern womanhood. And I realized that the failure that I was feeling was one that was given to me, that was inherited by my own social conditioning, by, all the men here are lovely, but by, millennia of patriarchy, and by the language of failure that was applied to the medicine that was given to me. So I was constantly being told by male consultants that I was failing to respond to the drugs. And a friend of mine was told she had an incompetent cervix. Someone else was told that they had an inhospitable womb. This is the language of judgment. And it's very difficult to sit there in a position where the person who has the power is the person using this kind of language and not feel like a failure. So I do think that there's a lot of work to be done there. And the solution that I give myself is not to have a 5-year plan. Because when you plan for your future and you have all of these ambitions that might not have their feet grounded in reality, by the time you get to a 5-year point, you feel like, and you haven't achieved all of those things that you said you're going to do, you feel like a failure according to your own metric. And then you've got to ask yourself, like, how you got the plan, because very often it's not a plan, as you say, that is suited to who you actually are as an individual. And a lot of our work, I think, as a global community is to work out who we are, aside from what capitalism is telling us who we are. So it's a super good point. The first question that you asked about the different kinds of failure, I'm so glad you asked me that, because it took me a long time to nail down my definition of failure. For ages, I just said it's when life doesn't go according to plan, but that doesn't take into consideration precisely what you were saying, which is a cataclysmic event that is entirely beyond your control. So during the time of writing Failosophy, not only was there a global pandemic, but a very, very close friend of mine had a massive brain hemorrhage and a stroke at the age of 38 and had to relearn how to walk and talk again. It would be monstrous for me to sit here and say, oh, you can just learn from that failure, just learn from it. And it will send you on a different path and you'll grow so much and you'll gain so much wisdom. And I really struggled with that for a while. And then I went on a press tour for a book to Amsterdam. And one of the journalists I met there told me that the Dutch have 2 words for failure. One is falen, which is a common or garden failure, like failing your driving test. And the other is pech, which is an existential failure, like a global pandemic that you have no control over. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that when you're faced with a failure beyond your control, the only thing that you can control is your response to it. And so dealing with failure in that context, I believe, starts with a degree of committed acceptance. You have to accept the situation that you find yourself in, even if that causes you pain. And then you need to adapt accordingly. You need to adapt your own parameters for what a successful life means. And one of the people that I often quote in this context is Mo Gaudat, who is one of my most downloaded podcast guests of all time. And he is someone who used to be a chief business officer at Google X. He developed an algorithm for happiness. And his algorithm was put to the ultimate test when his beloved son, Ali, died at the age of 21 during a routine operation. So that is a cataclysmic existential trauma, which he had no control over. And in the months after Ali's death, Mo would wake each morning in tears, and his first thought would be, Ali died. And after a few months of this, he thought, well, I just can't carry on living, sort of bearing the weight of this pain. And he said, I'm going to change the thought. I'm going to accept the fact that Ali's died, and I'm going to remind myself, but yes, he also lived. And by thinking each morning, Ali died, but yes, he also lived, it was the same thought, but differently expressed. And in that way, he could remember 21 years of incredible memories of a father and son who were more like best friends, and 21 years of shared wisdom and parenthood. And I think that goes back to what I was saying before, that pain is inevitable, grief is inevitable, failure is inevitable, but we don't have to live there constantly repeating that pain in our heads. So that's how I think we can deal with existential failure.
There's so much there, and that, you were talking about one of your most moving podcasts, which my colleague Phoebe says she listened to a few times, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. But since you touched on lockdown, first of all, can I just say, if possible, I'd love to come to Tanisk. I don't know if I'm saying your name properly, and Becca in a second, if you're available. But since you touched on lockdown, I'd love to talk about what I'm sure all of us have experienced, which is right at the start of lockdown, everyone was saying, not everyone, there were, people on social media going, I'm gonna, write a novel and learn Italian and DIY my whole house. And the failure to do that, any of that in my mind has been, I feel like some sort of extra time has been wasted, and I really haven't managed to do anything at all. And I'm sure lots of people feel like that on this call, that we haven't achieved all we wanted to with this extra time from not commuting and stuff. Phoebe's saying she started Korean lessons, Phoebe. But for those of us that aren't now fluent in Korean, do you have words of advice?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say to everyone, you're here, you are living through a global pandemic. The very fact that you are here and cogent and surviving is itself success. So please don't beat yourself up. There is no other thing that you could have done better. That is enough. And I was one of those people who started off lockdown thinking, oh my God, I'm going to have so much time. I need to fill it, and I'm going to learn Italian, do life drawing classes, and finally watch The Wire.
Which you should do because it's brilliant.
I know, but I didn't do it because I fell into a sort of slough of mild despond, which I'm sure lots of people can relate to. And I didn't really feel like doing anything. And I definitely didn't feel like being creative. And I tried to sit down and continue writing the novel that I was halfway through. And I was just like, this is rubbish. What am I doing? And I completely felt like that during the first half of lockdown. It wasn't helped by the fact that at the very beginning of lockdown, I found out I was pregnant, and I then miscarried 8 weeks into lockdown. And that was really, really difficult and very isolating because I couldn't do any of my normal distractions like going out with friends and sinking a bottle of red wine. On the flip side, it meant that I spent a lot of time with my partner that I might not otherwise have had. And in a way, although it was extremely painful, I think the pain was more quickly dealt with because I had to sit in it for a while. And it was sort of, I think looking back, it was kind of easier to process. But basically, what I would say is that you haven't failed at all. And I think that it's been very interesting to me how we've reassessed the quality of time. I feel like time's acquired a very sort of peculiar, elastic, foggy quality. And it's made me think a lot about what it must have been like to live through the world wars. Not that I'm comparing the two necessarily beyond that, but that combination of terror and boredom, the notion that you need to just wait and sit it out. We're not used to that in modern society. And although I wish it hadn't taken a global pandemic to make us confront our relationship with time and our manic busyness and the sort of fervent belief that being busy makes you a more worthy and moral person, I think that's one of the things that has come out of it, is that we've had to just sit with it for a while. And I think that's taught us something very important about what it means to live and the things that we take for granted and the things that we need and the amount of connection that we need. And I, for one, have realized that I dearly love about 5 people, and they are my closest friends. And I wasn't seeing them enough because my diary was filling with loads of other stuff that I felt I should do. And so that's been a very good wake-up call for me. And if anyone here has had a similar sort of wake-up call, then that again means that you haven't at all failed. And who cares about not doing a life drawing class? It's totally fine. Still haven't watched The Wire or Mad Men.
Wise, so very wise. Becca can't join us by video, so I'm going to read out her question. She says she appreciates your comments about faith and not necessarily being able to achieve positive outcomes by virtue of will or stating them. She's curious to hear your thoughts on the recent trend of toxic positivity, i.e. the idea that maintaining an extremely positive attitude will result in positive life outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, and thank you for making it, because in the social media age that we now live in, everything is in danger of becoming so popular it becomes a hashtag that ends up making you feel like you're somehow not doing enough. So initially we were sort of made to feel that we weren't enough because we weren't in our bikini bodies for summer and we weren't having vegan diets and we didn't have a 6-pack. Then the noble aims of the body positivity movement, I feel, got co-opted by a lot of brands thinking, oh, let's get on that bandwagon and let's use that to sell our shower cream or our range of leggings. And then body positivity in itself becomes something that you feel like you're also failing at, because you've got to wake up every morning and be really like, embrace your curves and be really like happy with the body that you're in. And you're not always happy with the body that you're in. And that's okay. It's okay to have a day where you feel a bit rubbish about yourself. And I do feel that there's a danger of that, absolutely, with the positivity movement, and to be quite honest, with the failure movements, because although I talk a lot about what we can learn from failure and how we can try and gain something positive out of something that might otherwise be a wholly negative experience, I by no means advocate failing for the sake of it. I don't fetishize failure. And as Nacho pointed out earlier, there's this whole Silicon Valley macho culture of kind of failing fast and failing often and getting investment for your business because you failed 3 times already, so therefore you're more marketable. And I don't really like all that narrative. I'm just espousing a kind of more gentler way and I hope a more nuanced way. And my point is basically, failure is inevitable and you should try your hardest at stuff. But if having tried your hardest, you still fail, it does not make you yourself a failure, and you don't need to beat yourself up endlessly about it. And that's it really in a nutshell. So I do think that there are, when things lose their nuance and become a one-dimensional hashtag, that's when we need to be wary of them. Okay.
Thank you. And can I come, as I've been promising to is it Tanisk? Sorry, I'm probably saying your name wrong. Hi.
Hi, it's Tanishq. Hi.
Hi. You were saying some interesting things in the chat about spreading yourself too thinly, failure coming from trying to do too much.
Yeah, so honestly, for me, it's I'm studying at university now, but I also went to a boarding school, and when we were at school, we had like a packed schedule throughout the day. You'd wake up at 6 a.m., you'd go for exercises, then you'd go for classes, then after classes, you'd go to extracurriculars, then you'd come back, you'd study, and then you'd have dinner and everything. So I think that kind of has percolated to me at university as well, without me kind of really understanding that the amount of commitment to any activity that I do has also gone up, alongside the fact that the level of studies obviously have also gone up, and also job applications, especially right now. Do I want to go into the traditional classic finance field, or do I want to do something that I actually enjoy doing that consistently comes and has an interplay? So it's really kind of gets really hard, and I honestly feel like all the time I'm spreading myself too thin. I don't do everything to the best of my ability, even if like that still results in me like having a burnout moment almost. So.
Oh, Tanishq, can I ask how old you are?
I just turned 20 in September.
Happy birthday for September. I so relate to everything that you're saying. I mean, not the age part. I'm slightly older than 20, sadly. But first of all, I want to say that I think you should do what you want to do and not the thing that you think you should do. And really try and work out who you are. Because I think the problem with school is, as you say, you're used to a kind of regimented environment where your goals are regularly assessed and you are given exam grades to tell you how well you're doing. When you enter adulthood, sorry, Ruth Lemon has a lovely cat who's just come on screen and has momentarily diverted me from that answer.
You love cats.
I love cats. My one's meowing outside the door because I won't let him in. Anyway, lovely cat. Sorry, Tanishq. I think when you enter adulthood, adulthood is bafflingly free of those signposts. So there's no exam that you can take that will tell you that you're doing a good enough job. But you've been conditioned to believe that. And you've also been conditioned to feel that well, in my experience, I felt that I had to please other people. And if you are good academically, that can become a sort of vicious circle where you do well, you're praised for doing well, and it almost becomes a substitute for finding out who you really are and what you really want, because you're just like concentrating at being good exams and getting praised for it. That was my experience. And my life imploded in spectacular style, age 35, because I had spent my whole life up to that point trying to please others and saying yes to everything, spreading myself too thinly because I didn't want other people not to accept me or not to like me if I said no and had boundaries for myself. And what I realized after a while was that that didn't work because I was exhausted, as it sounds like you are. And also what I'm doing there is I'm outsourcing my life to other people's perceptions of me and other people's judgment of the life that I should live. And that's a colossal waste of time. I want to live my life, and I want to have the time and the space to work out what that is. So my advice to you would be to block in slots in your diary that are just for contemplation. You're allowed to do that. You don't have to be busy every single second of every single day. You're not failing by taking that time for yourself. And you now are in charge of your own timetable and your own exam results. This is you now. And just on a purely pragmatic level, I would honestly block in just, I don't know, like a couple of hours a week where you do something just for you and you work out what you want, and don't for 1 second feel guilty about that. Because actually people pleasing, although it feels selfless, it ends up being quite selfish, because I never took the time to get to know myself, and I ended up making a series of wrong decisions, most notably who I got married to, and that is selfish ultimately, because I caused pain and I didn't want to do that. So if you take the time now, I promise you that it will work out really well in the future. And I think you have a really bright future ahead of you, and you seem completely lovely. And I hope university's okay in the time of COVID.
Yeah, it's going up and down, but yeah, thank you so much for it. Hopefully I can zone in on what I want to do, which is actually writing. So this
Yay! Definitely be a writer. That's terrible life advice.
Terrible life advice.
No, but
okay. That's your one worst bit of advice for the season.
I mean, I love writing, so I think you should totally do that.
You've had a lot of success. Tom's saying he wished he'd heard all of this 40 years ago. I'm going to come to a few people in a second. I can see, Robert, you've got your hand up. Faye, you're saying some interesting things in the chat. But before you do, you just touched on something really interesting, which is, so there are these 7 principles, and one of them that really stuck with me was that almost everyone feels that they failed in their 20s. And my favorite bit of that chapter was where you say, everyone tells you to dance like nobody's watching, but the thing is, everyone's watching and they're judging you. Are you doing the right steps? And especially now in social media, like everyone is watching. And in fact, elsewhere in the book, you talk about how online culture has sort of scared us into believing that any failure is humiliatingly public, and we've become totally risk adverse. What is your advice to this sort of generation of 20-year-olds who do feel like they've grown up in the public eye, when anything that goes wrong could just, come back to haunt you? Very different from how
you literally can't dance like no one's watching now on TikTok. I mean, TikTok, I just don't understand how people learn those dance routines. Everyone is so talented. It's just mind-blowing. I know, so uncoordinated. I am constantly incredibly grateful that I grew up without social media and without the internet. As much as I love social media and the internet for the good that it can do, and I'm an active user of it, I think it's incredibly overwhelming for people in their 20s, many of whom listen to the podcast and many of whom write me lovely messages about how lost they feel in that particular decade. And it's a difficult decade in any era, because it's the decade where, for many of us, it's the first time out of full-time education, where we're exploring what we're like as adults. But in a social media age, you have to be seen to be having a good time. And so you've got to be sort of posting pictures on Instagram of freshly baked vegan brownies and doing your TikTok dance in the evenings. But you've also got to find time to have a career at a time when unemployment is a very scary prospect in the gig economy. You need to earn enough money to pay your ever spiraling rents. You need to be in a serious relationship, or maybe having a series of one-night stands, according to sort of who you listen to. And you need to be doing all of this while keeping your sanity intact. And that's exhausting. And then the other thing that happens in tandem with that, in tandem with this age of curated perfection, is that we live in a society where there is a risk of being cancelled. And if you send out an ill-thought tweet one day, you could lose everything the next, because it could go viral and you could lose your job and your friends, and you just didn't think about it. So at precisely the time that in your 20s, you should be experimenting with sort of different modes of being and different identities, you are also hamstrung by a fear of failure that prevents you from taking those necessary risks in the first place. And my big fear is that by not taking those risks, there can be no growth or evolution, because you need to be allowed to make mistakes in order to learn. So it's an incredibly difficult time to navigate. And my advice would be, don't fall into the trap of thinking that your 20s are the most important decade where you have to have it all sorted, because you absolutely don't. It's actually your 10 years where you don't have to have things sorted. And my experience of age has been that it's incredibly empowering. And I think we have been sold a lie, particularly as women, that age diminishes us. And that's not my experience at all. You know, I turn 42 next month and I have never felt more myself. And it could be that your 20s aren't your decade, but it could just as well be that your 30s are, or that your 40s are, or that your 50s are. And your path is your path, and life is not a race. The object of life is not to do most things most quickly. The object of life is to do the things that are most meaningful to you, and to do them at an appropriate time that feels right to you. So that is the advice I would give, that just, you can cut yourself some slack.
Okay, I'm going to come to, thank you. I'm going to come to Robert now with his little blue digital hand up.
Hi, it's been really interesting listening to you all about that. The one thing I would like to add to the thing that you said about self-care and judging people or judging yourself about what you do is more about how you do it and which principles you live by. So that rather than racking up a checklist of things, I've done that, I've done that, I've done that, it's more a question of how did I do those things? Did I live by my principles of common good, about environmental controls, or about some other more deep-seated principles? In my case, it's very much about the golden rule, doing to others only as you would have done to yourself. Those kind of things. If you judge yourself by being able to make decisions and living by those principles, I think that is a big supporting framework for doing and carrying out other things. The only thing I'd like to negate what you, not negate what you said, but to say something a bit contrary. I have found in my, you talk about yourself being old at 40 odd, I'm 60 odd, and I would have to say right now I'm more aware of myself and what I can and can't do and what actually those principles are. And I find the need for some creative outlet. So the lockdown has enabled me to do some things which I've been stacking up to do, and have now actually kind of achieved some of those things. But guiding principles and living your life by principles must be the right way of doing things, rather than somebody else's checklist or some societal checklist.
Oh, Robert, I feel like I could listen to you all day, and also must commend you on your skincare regime, because you have the most amazing skin. I know that's not the point of any of this, but
Is that one of the things you've achieved in lockdown, Robert? An amazing skincare routine.
Yeah.
I think we all want to know what they are now. Can you just quickly tell us what you've achieved?
My principles, rather. I mean,
no, you said you'd done some creative things in lockdown that you've been meaning to do for ages.
So it really started just before lockdown, but certainly has taken off during lockdown. About 40 odd years ago, I spent 1 or 2 evenings at night school throwing some clay, pottery, and never did anything ever since, until just before lockdown. Really found myself thinking, I really like to do that. And I've now started throwing clay and being what I would now call a ceramic artist, or trying to be. And other people have commented on, actually, it is quite good, and eventually persuaded me to put some stuff up for sale. And I thought, well, this is just a hobby. I don't want to do anything like that. But in fact, I have turned my hand to stuff. I have sold quite a lot of stuff, and all of the proceeds have now gone to Heroes, the NHS frontline charity that's been set up by, I can't remember the guy's name, one of the doctors in.
That's an amazing achievement. Well done, you. I'm sorry I interrupted you, Elizabeth.
No, well, can we just listen to Robert? Can we just have Robert back for a ThinkIn next week? Are those your pots behind you, Robert?
Yes.
They're beautiful. I first of all thank you for being the person that you are, and you've put it so beautifully about living life according to your own principles, and that for me is summed up in integrity, and clearly you have so much of it. And you're absolutely right that that's the solution. Instead of constantly worrying about how you're perceived about, or what other people think, or how you're being judged on social media, to look internally to what gives you purpose and meaning. And it's so interesting that you should be talking about this right now, because to confess something to you all, publishing a book is a very strange process, and there's such a kind of degree of heightened anticipation that goes into it, and then it's published and you strive to constantly be a bestseller, and that's what everyone's sort of putting work into to make you do. And I got to number 12 in the chart, and I wasn't in the top 10. Now, oh boo-hoo, poor me. Like, part of me was like, oh, that's unfair. Part of like, this doesn't show me in a good light at all, this anecdote. Part of me was like, I put in the work, and I don't understand why some people get success all the time and others don't. And I suddenly realized that I was having my head turned by completely the wrong things, that I don't do what I do for those reasons at all. I do what I do because I believe in it, and because I like to think that the podcast and the books can hopefully help other people in some small way. And that gives my life meaning. And that's why I do what I do. But it is so difficult, even when I spend like all my hours doing this, to keep focused on that sometimes in the world that we live in, which is all about shiny baubles and ratings. And I just want to commend you for reminding me and all of us of that, because I totally agree with you, and I am going to take that note to heart.
Thank you both, and thank you for bearing your soul about only being number 12. We will all try and sympathise. Now I'm going to come to Faye now, who was saying some interesting things before in the chat about mental health. Are you there, Faye? Hello, Faye.
Hello. Yeah, no, this has been a wonderful session. Thank you. So I work for Mind, a mental health charity, and I work specifically in the workplace mental health side of things. And we talk a lot about creating psychologically safe working environments. And we know that one of the ingredients to that is employers creating a space where failure is actually seen as something that could be positive and people can learn and grow from. But we know that loads of employers don't do that. And we know that in this particular time when people are worried about their jobs, that actually the thought of failure in work is something that's really impacting on people. So I was just wondering if you had any advice of how employers could do better to create those environments where actually failure is seen as something that people can learn and grow from, and actually a positive thing.
Yeah, and thank you for the work that you do, Faye. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Mind is behind the RAP assessment, where there's a kind of mental health. Yeah. So
Yes,
I was introduced to this by one of my former podcast guests, Johnny Benjamin, who I know you probably know very well, mental health campaigner. And he told me about assessments that happen in mental health friendly workplaces about what you need to keep healthy from a mental perspective. So in the same way that your workplace will be assessed so that you don't get RSI, the work culture would be assessed for your response to it. And what that does is that the day you start work, if you just normalize having both a sort of physical space workplace assessment and a mental health workplace assessment, it enables you to bring your whole self to work and to say, actually, I'm having a panic attack today and I won't be able to come into work, and work will already be equipped to deal with that, and we'll be able to say that's fine because we've set up this system that enables you to work from home, because we knew from your initial assessment that this was a thing that you live with. And that, I think, is just such a brilliant way for employers to go about normalizing talking about mental health. The other thing that I would say is that there are certain companies that do a lot of great work on having mental health ambassadors. I'm a big advocate of having in-house therapists And there's a company called ClearScore that I know does this, that they have an in-house therapist who is there one day every fortnight, and you can go and see that therapist if you have something that you want to talk about. And what's good about that is that quite often offices have phone lines, but as anyone will know, if you're going through a sort of mental health crisis, sometimes the last thing you want to do is to pick up the phone and take that kind of action, because it feels so overwhelming and stigmatizing. Whereas if you just, again, have someone there during the normal course of the day, it's a bit like taking a lunch break and doing a yoga class. So that's another thing that I think is really helpful. And I also think it's incredibly helpful embracing the idea of people bringing their whole selves to work. I don't mean by that like weeping at your desk every day, but what I do mean by that is striving for a space where people can be authentic and honest with their employer-employee relationship. Because that's the thing about being a good leader. You actually have to be honest about who you are. You have to know yourself first. And I think you need to encourage that amongst your employees too. I do feel that with the global pandemic, we have learned interesting new ways to work. We've realized that actually a lot of people can work from home and are incredibly productive, because I know that one of the main arguments about not allowing people to work from home and not allowing flexible working is that we'd all just sit around drinking coffee, watching The Real Housewives. And I think we've proven beyond doubt that that is not the case. And I think that that's another avenue that can be really beneficially explored in terms of mental health, that sometimes someone might not feel like coming into work, but now with all the technology we have, we should be using that to get the best out of people and to enable them to work wherever they feel comfortable. But Faye, you would know way more about this than I do.
Lots of people saying lots of very nice things in the chat. Thank you to you all. There's a couple more of your principles that I want to touch on. I guess we could briefly talk about what I call the Ariana Grande chapter, which is where you talk about how breakups are not, you know which one I'm talking about, breakups are not a tragedy. The Thank You Next chapter, where you reference your podcast with the hot priest, Andrew Scott. And he says that he hates the term casual sex. And can you explain why?
Yes, so Andrew Scott was one of my favourite ever guests, actually, because the failures he chose was so brilliant. One of his failures was failure to be heteronormative. And I was like, God, you're really going to go there. And he made the point, we had this conversation about the language around sexuality, specifically the language around being gay and being asked about when you came out. And I have a personal issue with the idea of coming out, because it feels like you're sort of almost stepping out of the darkness into the light. It feels like you had something to sort of hide and feel ashamed of. And he said, yeah, I totally agree. And I also have an issue with the phrase openly gay, which is only ever used in the media. And he said, you know, I'm never introduced by my friends as openly Irish. And that led us into a discussion of casual sex. And he said, it's the same with casual sex. For me, there is no such thing as casual sex. It's trivializing and diminishing. I can have a one-night stand and it can be incredibly meaningful and important to me. And I just thought that that was so true and such a good way of looking at relationships, because a relationship is not a failure purely because it ends. I mean, the sad truth is that most of our romantic relationships do end, and a lot of our friendships end because we evolve in different ways and we have different friends for different phases of our life. And when Alain de Botton came on the podcast, he talked about this. He talked about the fact that breakups are not a tragedy, even though they feel like it at the time. And he said, you know, a parent raising a child would not think it was a failure if that child left home. They would think, we have raised a fully equipped citizen who can go out into the world, and that is the object of parenthood. And in the same way, what if we saw romantic relationships in a similar manner, where someone comes into our life and they teach us something that we need to know, or they give us 2 years of wonderful experiences and then they go on their way, and that should be okay. And we can still celebrate the time that we had together and not see it as a tragedy purely because it ended. And I really liked that concept, because I've gone through 6 serious breakups in my life. I know, Nacho, it's hard to believe. I'm sure exes would disagree with me, including a divorce, and every single breakup has massively sucked. It is a very peculiar form of sadness and heartbreak. And hearing Anna de Botton saying that really, really helped me. And I think it's helped lots of other people get through it as well. Someone can come into your life, teach you something, it can be meaningful, and then it could end.
Thank you. And I'm so conscious we've got lack of time, and I just really want to turn to the other story that I actually read out to my husband because I thought it was so good when I came, which is your fellow podcaster, Deborah Frances-White. Now, this was a story about comedians improvising, and it was under the principle failure is data acquisition. And she tells, well, you tell the story, but a great story about doing improvisation and people walking out. It just sounds so horrific, but it's so interesting.
Yeah, so Deborah Frances-White, who hosts the Guilty Feminist podcast, was one of my guests in one of the earlier seasons. And I hadn't realised that she had a background in drama and improv. And when she said, I want to talk about improv as one of my failures, I was like, oh my gosh, it's going to be all about like black leotards and smoking. But it's so fascinating because she said that in the early days of being a drama student, she was asked to do this improv exercise, which I think it was called and now, and then, and yeah, and she had to get up on stage and improvise material that would entertain an audience of, say, 10 people. But the concept was that anyone could get up and walk out of their seat if they were bored by what she was doing. So, which is utterly terrifying. So she would have to constantly keep people entertained and come up with new tactics for keeping people entertained. And after a while of doing this, she worked out what worked for a crowd, and it wasn't always the thing that she had thought previously would work. And that was the foundation of her thinking. Failure is data acquisition. You've got to be willing to fail to acquire the necessary data that you need in order to keep that improv crowd entertained. And I think that it's a mindset that can be applied to so many different areas of life. And she gave the example of a scientist working on a cure for a terrible disease, say working on a vaccine for COVID-19.
For example.
That scientist, if something went wrong in an experiment and the experiment didn't work, that scientist would not necessarily think that experiment's gone wrong, so I'm a massive failure as a scientist. They would hopefully think, that's gone wrong, that's taught me something really necessary about what doesn't work, and that will bring me closer to the thing that does work because I can eliminate the wrong thing from my inquiries. And I just think that you can use that in so many aspects of life. It's sort of depersonalizing failure, so that just because you fail or an experiment fails doesn't mean that you yourself are a hopeless failure. And I said to her at the time, I was like, oh, you could use that for dating. So every time you go on a hopeless online date and the guy doesn't respond to your WhatsApp the next day when the 2 ticks go blue, instead of thinking, I must be rubbish and no one will ever want to date me, you could think instead, well, thank you, wrong person, for eliminating yourself from my inquiries, because that will bring me closer to the person who is right for me, or make me realize I don't need a person at all. And I do speak from experience because I met my now fiance on Hinge. So I do know how tough it is out there, but that mindset really helped me.
Thank you so much. We have sadly come to the end of another brilliant thinking with you, Elizabeth Day. You've got so many pearls of wisdom, as I said in the medal. You're so wise, but just want to thank you for what you call your field work into failure, aka asking everyone nosy questions on our behalf. I wrote down a line here which is not in the book, but which will stay with me. We've been culturally conditioned to expect a smooth motorway when life is really about getting stuck on country byroads and learning from it. And also to learn that life is not a race, that we come across different challenges at different stages in our life, and to be zen about that, even if it is a bit woo-woo. And thank you again for telling us about your own angst about not getting into the top 10, although if everyone buys it on then perhaps we could do you that favor. So Elizabeth's book, Failosophy is out now. It's really enjoyable, and has been this hour. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who contributed in the chat and who spoke. And as is usual, we cannot clap her, so we merely must awkwardly wave her out and say good luck in your wedding in December. Nacho will mourn it, but we will all celebrate.
Thank you. I've loved it. I love Tortoise, and I love you, Merope, and thank you to everyone for your incredible questions.
See you next year, I hope. Bye.